The specification asks for philosophical definitions and concepts of miracle, including inherent difficulties with the concepts of laws of nature and an interventionist God. What this means is that you should know different philosophical definitions of miracle, such as scholars like Augustine, Aquinas, Tillich, Holland, Swinburne and Hume. The kinds of questions we've seen on this topic are as follows. We've seen A. Examine what philosophers understand by the term miracle. Here, more than one definition was expected. Any philosopher can be credited, and the most common included Aquinas, Holland, Hume, Swinburne, Hick and Mackie. We have also seen examine philosophical issues raised by the concept of miracle. Here, candidates could look at the problems of definition and include different definitions. They could also make suggestions made for the problems with these different definitions. For example, what these definitions mean for God's nature, along with a fusion of points from the next part of the specification, considering challenges to belief in miracles. We will explore the definitions from a variety of scholars and the issues that they face within this film. Philosophically speaking, it's always good practice to define the terms laid out for any discussion of a concept. If all involved understand a concept in the same way, then discussion about the truth or reality contained therein is a lot easier. When it comes to talking about miracles, if we can agree on one definition of miracle, it's much easier to decide whether or not such a thing exists. We can say that any event that fits the definition we have agreed is a miracle. Anything that does not fit that definition is not. Hume's definition of miracle attempts to achieve just that. He begins his challenges to the existence of the concept of miracle by defining what he means by one. He would argue that a miracle, should such a thing exist, is best defined as a transgression of a law of nature by a particular volition of the deity or by the interposition of some invisible agent. What he means by this is that a miracle would be a break in the laws of nature, where what we would expect to happen every time, on one occasion does not, and that the cause of this is not nature itself, but a god or other supernatural entity. What we have to decide is, firstly, is Hume's definition necessary for an acceptance of a miraculous event? Does it have to be the case without exception? And secondly, is it sufficient? Is it enough, or is there more that is needed in this definition? Hume's definition of miracle has been hugely influential on all subsequent philosophical debate of this question. As you will see, his definition certainly appears as a feature in the definition of many other scholars. Mackie was an Australian atheist philosopher who wrote the acclaimed Miracle of Theism. In this book, he reviewed the work of Hume on miracles. He essentially agrees with Hume, and his work clarified and expanded some of Hume's ideas. For Mackie, a miracle would be defined as a violation of a law of nature, brought about by a divine or supernatural intervention. He says the laws of nature describe the ways in which the world, including humans, work when left to itself, when not interfered with. A miracle occurs when the world is not left to itself, when something distinct from the natural order as a whole intrudes into it. There are a number of issues arising from a Humean-style definition of miracle. If we were to exemplify what kinds of events could be considered miracle from these definitions, we could include such biblical examples as the parting of the Red Sea in Exodus, or God making the sun stand still in the sky for Joshua during his battle against the Amorites. However, it raises a number of questions. Firstly, does it make sense to say that God can intervene in nature? It suggests God is simply a spectator, and God steps in to tweak events here and there. However, theists regard God as a being on which the universe is utterly dependent for its existence. Thus, God cannot intervene, as he is the sustainer and preserver anyway. He is omnipresent. Having said this, if God sustains the world through natural laws, then he could theoretically intervene if the world self-governs according to the principles he's set up. A second issue to be discussed is the character of a natural law. If, as Hick suggests, a law of nature is a retrospective description of an event that has happened, then there can never be any violation of one. If an unusual event happened, we would simply explain it. Alternatively, a law of nature might be seen as incomplete if a supposed miracle occurred. We would just have to adjust our definition. In this case also there can be no break. Some scientists consider the degree to which chance and randomness occur within nature, in which case we might never be able to tell if a law had been broken or not. Swinburne claims that a law of nature is what we would usually expect to happen. Thus we can accept the resurrection of Christ as a miracle because it is unusual. We of course cannot test a miraculous occurrence scientifically to see if it violates natural laws, because of course the whole point of a miracle is that it is rare, or even a one-off event, and thus is not repeatable. So we might argue that we can never know whether or not such an event violates natural laws because it's not open to being checked. However, this might not be sufficient to cover all events that might be deemed miraculous. If we accept this, then we might end up accepting any unusual event as miracle that might potentially be explainable. We might go on and look at the issue that maybe it is not sufficient to say that there must be the intervention of a supernatural agent for an event to be a miracle. Many scholars would argue that there needs to be some significance or meaning behind such an event. This is definitely missing from Hume's definition. In addition, we will shortly be raising the question of whether or not a law of nature has to be broken in order for a miracle to be said to occur. This definition is then very narrow. It does not allow for any event that appears to work within natural laws, and yet which has spiritual significance or meaning. For instance, the parting of the Red Sea in Exodus at the command of Moses has been analysed, and naturalistic explanations have been offered for such an event. If that is indeed the case, then according to the definition from Hume, it's not a miracle that has taken place. Yet the timing and fortuity of such an event, along with the extreme unlikelihood of it occurring, would mean that to some God has acted within natural laws. Such a definition of miracle may well then be inadequate, since not everyone will feel that it can cover God's ability to work in the world. Hume is defining miracles according to his own agenda. He has defined them in such a way that he's able to dismiss them, and so will not be prepared to discuss events that occur outside this definition. Mackie's phrasing, as distinct from Hume's, would also allow us to question whether events that occur according to what we ordinarily perceive to be natural laws, but without the workings of them, could be considered to be miraculous. God might provoke an event within our ordinary experience, but according to a different time frame or without the ordinary workings. This idea is further explored by Aquinas. Augustine, writing well before Hume in De Utilitate Credendi, appears to see a miracle in the same way as Hume. However, he claimed in City of God that a miracle is not contrary to nature, but only to our knowledge of nature. Miracles are made possible by hidden potentialities in nature, which are placed there by God. Here, Augustine is not denying that events such as the resurrection of Christ or turning water into wine occurred. Instead, he's saying that they did happen and they were God's direct intervention in the world. However, they do not violate natural laws because the whole of God's created order is set up in such a way that God can and does act. The purpose of such events was and is to produce faith on the part of humanity. Aquinas, developing Augustine's view, gives a very similar definition to Hume in the first instance. Here he is clearly separating the natural order from a miraculous event. However, he was quite careful to insist that a miracle is not contrary to nature in any absolute sense, since it is the nature of all created things to respond to God's will. Aquinas goes on to distinguish between three different types of miracles. This explanation is wider than that of Hume and Mackie. It allows for events that God could perform that occur within the natural laws rather than completely outside of them. The first definition would be in accordance with our previous ideas, such as in Joshua 10, when God allows the sun to stand still in the sky for longer than the usual in order for Joshua and his army to finish their battle. The second example would include events such as living after being dead. There's something that occurs that is outside the usual workings of nature, but which can ordinarily be achieved. Life is not against the working of nature, but life after being dead is. The third kind of miracle is one such as getting better from an illness in an instant rather than it taking time. Here it might be said that a doctor could have healed, given enough time, but in this instance did not. Some of these events would not be considered miracles according to Hume's definition. However, with Aquinas' broader definition, they would be assessed. Aquinas also distinguished between God as a primary cause and as a secondary cause. A primary cause is when God acts directly in the world to bring about a miracle. God can do this without the need of a secondary cause. A secondary cause is when God acts through human agents. This is known as double agency. This means that God can bring about a miracle working through human beings. Both God and the human agents are therefore involved in that miracle. Like Aquinas, Swinburne has a broader definition, which includes the breaking of natural laws, but also allows for events that Hume and Mackie would not. He says that if something breaks the law of nature, which is so well established, then we should not revise our understanding of the law of nature, as some suggest we should do. We have good evidence about what the laws of nature are, so any modification would be clumsy and ad hoc. To expect us to revise our understanding of natural laws because of a single reported instance of someone walking on water, for example, seems unreasonable in the extreme. It should be classed as a break in the law of nature, and therefore a miracle, providing that the two following criteria are met. Firstly, the time scale in which it occurs should be quicker than the norm, for example, someone who recovers from polio in a minute. Secondly, there needs to be a deeper significance as reason for it to happen. For example, it would show God's nature to the world. Swinburne attempts to give examples of the concept of such transgression of the natural order by using scripture. Swinburne recognises that human freedom and God's intervention may appear incompatible, so he does say that such intervention doesn't happen too often. He asks us to bear in mind two principles when considering whether miracles could be said to occur. These principles back up his claim that miracles, as he defines them, can occur. These are the principle of credulity. If it seems that something is the case, then it probably is. In other words, what you think you have seen or think has happened probably has been seen and has happened. This is a principle of rationality. It's necessary to trust the information that appears in front of us. The skeptic would thus need to disprove the occurrence of a miracle in the face of such an appearance. Also, the principle of testimony. In the absence of good reason to the contrary, descriptions of events are generally as people report them. In other words, people generally tell the truth. Pragmatically speaking, this is the way we usually operate in any other areas of life. It's necessary to believe what people tell us for the most part, since if we did not, then we'd find it difficult in our scepticism to function at all. The difficulties here with Aquinas and Swinburne are similar to that of Mackie and Hume, in that we have the same queries regarding an interventionist God, laws of nature, and the sufficiency or necessity of their definitions. However, Aquinas and Swinburne both have broadened their definitions to include events that may be in accordance with natural laws, but without the operation of them. One issue here is that Swinburne's definition seems to include only those events that work outside nature's usual order, yet he insists that such events have deep significance. Thus an event that breaks the law of nature and yet does not have any clear meaning would not be considered a miracle. This seems to be inconsistent, since if such an event did occur, then one would have to ask what it is if it is not a miracle. In addition, what about those events that seem to point towards a deeper understanding of God and yet do not strictly break a natural law? For example, a fortuitous coincidence that can be said to tell us something about God. An example given by Peter Vardy is of the church choir, who were all usually punctual in their attending choir practice and were all individually delayed at least by 10 minutes on the same day for different reasons. This does not break the laws of nature, but since on this day a malfunction with the furnace caused an explosion and destroyed the church building, the choir would have certainly been harmed if they had been there. This does not break nature's laws, but can be seen to have deeper significance, since it shows to the choir God's protection over them and his love for each of them. Thus Swinburne's definition seems inadequate, as it does not clearly allow for such events to be included within it. Hick develops Swinburne's understanding here in a rather different direction. Hick tends towards a critical realist position, usually whereby he sees the origin of religious accounts as having an objective reality, but that this is perceived in more subjective ways by the individual person. Here we might not question the reality of an event, but what we understand it as actually being will differ for each person. Hick invokes his experiencing as concept of religious faith here, inspired by Wittgenstein's seeing as. The atheist and the theist experience their environments differently and thus interpret events in a different way. An event that moves the theist to see God as provident would not cause the atheist to experience the same. What is most important here is not whether or not a break has occurred in the laws of nature, but whether or not the event has religious meaning and significance. If a miracle is a break in the law of nature, then we can say a priori that miracles do not happen. His reason is that the laws of nature are built up on the basis of past experience. This gives us a framework and a structure necessary for going about our day-to-day life. But if tomorrow something happened that is contrary to the law of nature, we should not say that the law of nature has been broken. Instead, we say that we need to extend our current understanding of that law of nature in order to take into account the new findings. But he says if a miracle is termed as an event that has religious significance, which gives a sense of the presence and activity of God, then miracles do occur. Tillich defines miracles as signs with religious significance. He understands that they are astonishing, but does not accept that they need to violate the laws of nature. He claims that miracles point to the mystery of being. They reveal something about God's nature, and in this sense the individual can perceive God. They are received as a sign in an ecstatic experience, and are only given to those for whom they are a sign, and they are received in faith. Essentially like Hick, Tillich takes a critical realist position when it comes to miracles. R.F. Holland's definition of miracle does not involve a break in the law of nature at all. What is seen as a miracle is all down to interpretation. He says coincidence can be taken religiously as a sign and called a miracle. This is an example of an anti-realist understanding of miracle. Here the word miracle is correctly applied if it coheres with the understanding of miracle within the religious form of life of the person making the claim. It would then be true to describe something as a miracle if it makes sense within their form of life. This is in contrast to the definitions we've seen above that take a more realist understanding and see a miracle as only being true if the event is caused by God himself. Holland gives an example of a child playing with a toy car who accidentally moves onto a railway crossing near his house and gets his car stuck in the rails. An express train is due to pass. The signals are in its favour, and the curve of the track is such that it would be impossible for the driver to stop in time if he saw the child. The boy does not realise the train is coming and continues to try and free his car. The explanation given for the train's timely stopping was that the driver had fainted for a reason that had nothing to do with the presence of the child on the line, and the brakes were applied automatically as his hands ceased to exert pressure on the controls. Suppose that the mother says this is a miracle. Holland says that this can be termed a miracle because of this as the mother's interpretation of it. Others, in a similar vein, will say that God could indeed have acted through the laws of nature to bring about this series of coincidences. Scholars such as Tillich, Holland and Hick are subject to the challenge that there is no real distinction between a miracle and an ordinary event. These definitions are so broad as to undermine the whole idea of God's actual action in the world. They become subjective. In fact, in the case of Holland, we might say that every single event in the world can be attributed to a unique and enormously complex series of coincidences. It is then not possible to isolate any one of these coincidences as proof that it has been caused by something different from all the others. Holland himself admits that such an event cannot, without confusion, be taken as a sign of divine interference with the natural order. So he denies the objective reality here of God's action in the world. Hume would of course flatly deny that any such event could be considered miraculous. Nothing is esteemed a miracle if it ever happens in the common course of nature. Here we do not need to dispute that the event happened. We do not need to question the cause even. But in this case there seems little or no room for the objective truth or accuracy of any claim for the divine cause. Wiles challenges those who say that miracles are acts of God against the laws of nature. He had this view as he said that a God who would intervene but did not on every occasion would be a God who could be rejected on moral grounds. This raises the inherent difficulty of accepting an interventionist God. Why would God act here to perform a miracle rather than there? Such a God who seems to choose miracle randomly would not, according to Wiles, be a God worthy of worship. So miracles defined as individual actions in the world do not happen. Instead, he sees a miracle as there being a single act of God, which is the world as a whole. However, the lack of miracles as individual instances does not mean that connected Christian beliefs are jeopardised. Prayer, for example, still has a purpose, but should not be understood as asking God to take action. Instead, it should be a way of helping a group or individual to connect with God's will. Wiles said that prayer is the capacity to attain, however incompletely, some awareness of that intention. Wiles' restriction on God's action to perform miracles also applies to his action in Christ. He cannot say miracles do not happen, but then allow the incarnation and resurrection of Jesus. Wiles claims that the doctrine of the incarnation and resurrection do not include a break in the laws of nature. So the incarnation is the perfection of human response to God. The full humanity of Jesus is central, and Jesus fully responded to God's grace in doing so, incarnated God in the world. A miracle could also be described as a change for the better in the person. So from the A-level student who now always hands in essays on time, whereas before they had to be chased, to the terrorist who became a pacifist under this definition, a miracle has occurred. The difficulty with Wiles' response is that whilst it accommodates so many of the difficulties that we've encountered with others, such as Hume, we are left with the fact that Wiles' definition, like Holland's, does not distinguish between a miracle and an ordinary event that could happen to anyone. This undermines the idea of God's activity in the world, which appears to be so central to scripture and religious teaching. It also means that if there is no reality to such events and miracles, then there is no reason to attribute any knowledge of God to them. God is superfluous to their explanation, and in fact this anti-realist position, however positive, simply proposes knowledge about the person rather than God.